On today to the Center for Drug Evaluation Research's 2019 Prescription Drug Labeling Conference. And for the folks that are visiting Washington, D.C. In the room, there's a lot of activities around this area. We have over 25 Smithsonian museums. We have art galleries. The Wizards are playing Thursday night. And as you know, we're the home of at least the U.S. professional baseball championship team, the Washington Nationals. So that's a big event for us. A lot of us work in prescription drug labeling, and people may ask us, what is that about, and why is that important? And typically we may say, we're trying to communicate how to use drugs safely and effectively to healthcare practitioners, patients, and/or their caregivers. And some people may say, well, why is that important? We may think of signs. I think a lot of us have come across signs that may be confusing, may be difficult to read, may be misconstrued. So I'm showing some examples of those types of signs. As you can see, your sign on the right side of the slide, it's a confusing, inconsistent message. On one part of the slide, it says, use the elevator, and another part of the slide, it says that the elevator does not work. On the right side of the slide, it talks about a floor moving, which seems a little bit impossible. In this slide right here on the right, if I saw such a slide, I would probably try to find different parking, even if I was allowed to park. I wouldn't mind walking 2 or 3 blocks. The slide on the right actually reminds me of a sign at the White Oak Building, in one of the White Oak Building in our campus. We have a fantastic campus in Silver Spring, the FDA does, but we do have one building with very confusing signs. So when you go to that building, you really should go early because it's very easy to get lost. So basically, the goals of the conference, as Brenda was outlining before, is really to try to improve prescription drug labeling. And essentially, there are 3 main types of prescription drug labeling: prescribing information, which is essentially geared to healthcare practitioners, FDA-approved patient labeling. In this conference here, we're specifically going to talk about instructions for use for patients. And the third main type is carton and container labeling, which is geared to healthcare practitioners, patients, and/or caregivers. We'll also talk about how to improve structured product labeling or SPL labeling files, how to improve their accuracy when you're submitting those files to the FDA. So a couple of pointers about topics that are outside the scope of the conference. There are a lot of hot topics with respect to drugs in terms of drug development. So hot topics include real-world data, real-world evidence, the patient experience. These are extremely important topics. I know industry, the public, academia, FDA, many working groups on this topic. So people may ask us, how do you incorporate this information in labeling? I would say this is kind of a relatively early stage to be talking about this. We need a little more experience about how to incorporate this information in labeling. And then at subsequent meetings, webinars, conferences, we will provide some considerations for this. It's a little bit early at this conference to be talking about those topics. Additionally, as you know, labeling is a communication tool. It's basically how to incorporate information in labeling. It's not about we're not going to talk about what types of evidence do you need to support a labeling claim. How many studies do you need? What endpoints do you need? The duration of the trial, the exposure. How many patients do you need in your safety database? So that is slightly that's outside the purview of the conference, primarily because the experts that we have talking are labelers. Some of us do work on drug development, but the concentration is labeling review and development. But the good news is there is a mechanism to provide feedback to the FDA. In fact, I don't know if anyone attended. There was a great public meeting that the FDA hosted at the White Oak campus about a month ago. It was about promoting efficient and effective drug development while not compromising safety standards. At this conference, we had about 25 division directors present, almost all of our division directors. We had about 25 presenters that gave FDA feedback. The good news is that we have a docket that's open and it's listed. The link to the docket is listed on the slide, and we'll be looking at all those comments. So if you have recommendations about how to improve efficiency, about drug development, please let us know. So today, as you know, it's a two-day conference. Each of the conferences will have an FDA presenter and may have several FDA panelists. The topics today are mostly concentrated on the prescribing information for healthcare practitioners. We will have a talk about structured product labeling later in the day. Tomorrow's agenda is slightly more diverse. In addition to the prescribing information, particular talks about clinical pharmacology information and labeling and biological product labeling, specifically biosimilar labeling and transition product labeling. It's going to be a little broader. We'll be talking about instructions for use for patients, product quality information across many different labeling types, and carton and container labeling issues. So on to the first talk of the day, voluntary PLR conversions and updating prescribing information. As Brenda noted, our team previously was known as the Labeling Development Team. We recently changed our name to the Labeling Policy Team. So my disclaimer, basically, one thing of note is that the examples that I'm showing in this presentation and subsequent presentations may not show or display all the required information by regulations or statutes, and they may not have all the recommendations in our final guidances. And that's because it's for presentation purposes. It's difficult to include everything potentially from the adverse reaction section on a slide. So the learning objectives for this talk, it's basically about, number one, encouraging voluntary physician labeling rule, PLR, labeling submissions, voluntary PLR conversion labeling submissions, discuss principles in updating the prescribing information, and also sharing our updated resources. So as we know, there are only two types of formats for prescribing information. One, what we call the old format, which is based upon the 1979 regulations and final rule, 1979. And the second one, what we call physician labeling rule, which is based upon the 2006 final rule and associated regulations called PLR. So there were lots of changes between the 1979 old format final rule and the PLR format in 2006. Number one, sections were ordered according to clinical importance. For example, in old format, the description section is the second or first section, depending upon whether you have a box warning, and now it's section 11. Previously in old format, or currently in old format, the precaution section contains a lot of diverse pieces of information about drug interactions, specific populations, for example, pregnancy, pediatric use, geriatric use, non-clinical information, information for patients. Those sections or subsections were dispersed and reordered in PLR in order of clinical importance. So we have for a long time encouraged voluntary PLR conversion. We've said this in the PLR rule in multiple Federal Register notices. We've stated that PLR format represents a more useful and modern approach for communicating accurate and up-to-date information on the safe and effective use of prescription drugs. And so we encourage you to think about your portfolio, specifically your products that have labeling in old format under NDAs and BLAs. and to consider voluntary PLR conversion update. As Brenda mentioned, we had a conference, a last conference was in 2017. During that time, Farouk Sarabi presented many considerations about how to PLR convert, and we have many different tools. I encourage you to seek out those tools and to look at his presentation. FDA is here also to help you with those efforts, and I'll describe some of that later in the presentation. So this slide presents the percentage of CDER regulated NDAs and BLAs that have labeling in PLR format, physician labeling format. So currently, as of last month, approximately 65% of our NDAs and BLAs have labeling in PLR format. And that's a huge jump from about 5 to 6 years ago. We were only at 45%. And that's increased almost every single year, which is great news. So we thank you for your voluntary PLR conversions. In fact, we've approved 234 voluntary PLR conversions, and we still are working on several additional voluntary PLR conversions that you have submitted. So we thank you for doing that. Additionally, with respect to the breakdown, most of our products, a majority of our products are drug products under NDAs, and 64% of NDAs have labeling in PLR format. We have about 150 BLAs. That number is climbing. A significant proportion of our new novel products that we approve every year are biological products. We have about 150 again in CDER. CBER has probably about 300, so those numbers are increasing. But BLAs, about 94% of BLAs have labeling in PLR format. With respect to ANDAs, for generic drugs, slightly lower at 44%, but that number has climbed. So what are we doing to try to encourage updating labeling, updating prescription drug labeling? So we talked about the voluntary PLR conversion effort. We have our team and many others, a lot of folks that you'll see on the stage today and tomorrow, train other CDER staff on review and developing prescribing information. We have over 1,000 people in CDER that review and develop prescribing information. As you know, there are multiple guidances that come out. There are new statutes that come out. And it's a continuous training to ensure that we have a consistent approach on how we review and develop labeling. A big effort from the agency is to publish more guidances, and when we publish draft guidance to finalize guidance, and we've had a remarkable number of guidances published, specifically labeling guidances, and a lot of those guidances we'll discuss here today. We provide labeling oversight, and I'll show some examples of that later in the presentation, and public outreach. Like, for example, a conference, the 2-day conference today. We also do some webinars, answer questions. So the previous slide, I talked about some of the broad things, but we also work on individual labeling. So when application holders submit NDAs and BLAs to us or submit supplements, CDER as a whole work with application holders to try to improve the quality of the prescribing information, partly because we recognize a lot of application holders, they may never have submitted an NDA or BLA before, or potentially someone on the team has never submitted a labeling before. So given we recognize that, we're here to help and partner with you in updating prescription drug labeling. We are about to begin some qualitative research on the prescribing information. Frequently we get questions, what's the appropriate terminology to use? How will healthcare practitioners interpret terms like contraindication or do not use or should not use or not recommended or avoid use? So we want to get feedback from physicians. We're going to do some surveys with over 60 physicians to get that feedback. When we have the research done, we'll post it on the website, and I provided a link to that website. We also continuously update existing labeling resources and provide new labeling resources, and I'll talk about that later in my presentation. One of the things we do is have dedicated labeling specialists in CDER. So labeling specialists in CDER include the associate directors for labeling. They're in several, almost all the prescription drug review divisions. The Office of New Drugs in CDER is undergoing a reorganization. And with that reorganization, we're going to get additional associate directors for labeling. And this program has been very successful. The quality of our labeling has tremendously improved. You have labeling experts in each of the, each or almost all of the divisions, and they have the subject matter expertise about labeling and also a deep understanding of the therapeutic areas and the products that division regulates. We also have multiple labeling specialists, and most of those folks are going to talk today. We have clinical pharmacology specialists in the Office of Clinical Pharmacology. We have biological product labeling specialists. We have patient labeling specialists, product quality labeling specialists. Now, I'm only listing here the dedicated labeling specialists. We have, as I stated, over 1,000 folks in CDER that review and develop prescribing information. They have many tasks, including review applications. So updating prescribing information. So as we know, the prescribing information is written for the healthcare practitioner. It's not written for a certain organization. It's not written for consumers. It's not written for patients. And that's one of the bedrock principles when we develop prescribing information. The prescribing information, it contains a summary of the essential information needed to use the drug safely and effectively. The prescribing information must be accurate, and it must not be promotional. And if there's new information that becomes available that causes the labeling to become inaccurate, misleading, or false, that labeling must be updated. So in our view, the application holder is fundamentally responsible for the contents of the prescribing information. To that end, our statute states what I talked about before: the labeling must be updated if the labeling becomes out of date. And potentially labeling could be considered misbranded if that is the case. We have encouraged, through guidance, application holders to at least review the prescribing information once a year, if not more, given that there's new information that comes out. So here are some of the broad principles of updating labeling, and for each of these situations, I'm going to give you some actual examples later in the presentation. So the prescribing information must meet regulatory requirements and statutory requirements, and should be consistent with final guidances. Now, I should note, with respect to final guidances, there may be alternative acceptable approaches as long as those approaches meet applicable statutes and regulations. Labeling should have a consistent message, and we talked about some of those signs before with respect to the elevator sign that show you could use the elevator, but you can't use the elevator. Sometimes in labeling, we see that inconsistent message. Consistency potentially within the full prescribing information. Sometimes there's inconsistency between what we see in the highlights of prescribing information and the full prescribing information. Improving organization and formatting. John Gallagher, later today, he'll be discussing some specific examples of that. And we also talked about that in the signs, that sign that you really can't read it. If you can't read it, how useful will it be to a healthcare provider? Update terminology. As time goes on, terms change. Risk mitigation strategies change. Practice of medicine changes. Guidances change. So we should be removing outdated or misleading or clearly inapplicable information, or revising that. Finally, we recommend when you submit a labeling submission, we recommend you review the entire labeling and potentially update the entire labeling, not that just one section or subsection that, that you're initially interested in, given that other parts of the labeling may become out of date. So with respect to ensuring consistency with statutes, regulations, and final guidances, if applicable, we do have a new statute, the Cures Act, which was passed a few years ago, and that did change. For example, we have a limited population pathway, LPAD, and there are new labeling requirements by statute. This is a particularly narrow area, I would say. These are for antibacterial, antifungal products for a serious or life-threatening condition that there's an unmet need. So there's new labeling requirements. There's also labeling requirements by statute for antimicrobial products and antimicrobial products, different cut points, susceptibility criteria. In subsection 12.4, the microbiology subsection of the clinical pharmacology section. In addition, as many of you are familiar, the pregnancy, lactation, and labeling rule came out about 4 years ago, where in implementation, the second cohort of implementation, we will have a talk. Christy and Miriam will be talking later today about PLR updates. So obviously that is a very important new rule. With respect to recent final guidances, we'll be talking about this actually later today, the pediatric labeling guidance and the accelerated approval labeling guidance. Guidances come out a lot, and we should, the labeling should be consistent, although other approaches may be acceptable. Now, this is about a consistent message. In this fictitious example, the contraindication section states that the drug is contraindicated in patients with severe renal impairment. However, the warnings and precautions section states that the drug is not recommended, which is a slightly different message. Contraindication, how we define it, is never, ever, ever give the drug. The risk always outweighs the benefit. Not recommended, potentially being it is potentially possible to give the drug. And you look at the use in specific population section, it states that you can use the drug in patients with severe renal impairment, but use it cautiously. So you have 3 different messages. So a healthcare practitioner, he or she who reads the prescribing information, it's not clear what the message is. So basically, think about what is the message. And in this case, potentially the message is it's not recommended. So we recommend a consistent approach throughout the labeling, as you notice in this fictitious example, because it's not recommended, it's not a contraindication, the contraindication section was removed. Organization and formatting. This fictitious example has important dosage adjustment information due to drug interactions, patients receiving a strong 3A4 inhibitor. It also has an important dosage modifications due to an adverse reaction, neutropenia. But it may be difficult to access because the information is spread across many subsections for unclear reasons. So the items in the green is about adverse reactions, and the items in blue is about dosage adjustments due to drug interactions. And so, for example, if you're a patient, if you're interested in how to adjust the dosage for neutropenia, you have to go across 2 different subsections, and you may miss that other important information. Additionally, some of the titles, if you look at the title for subsection 2.2, it's not really apparent what that title is about, general. So in general, that's one of the major principles, and we have some guidances that talk about this, that the title of the subsection should generally match the information in the body of the subsection. Here is an after. This is an improved labeling, as you can see. So the green, again, is we collated all the information about drug dosage adjustments due to neutropenia. A table was added about how to dosage adjust for different neutropenia severities, and the dosage adjustments due to drug interactions was incorporated in its own specific subsection. As you notice, the titles of the subsections were appropriately named so healthcare providers can find that information more readily if they look at the table of contents. So updating terminology, removing and revising outdated, misleading, or clearly inapplicable information. So in this slide and subsequent slides, I'll give you several examples, but this is not exhaustive. There are many examples of this. As you know, sometimes disease names change. So for example, Wegener's granulomacytosis, that name was changed to granulomacytosis with polyangiitis, a different name. So maybe 10 years ago, the labeling talks about adverse reactions in this condition, but the name changed. So we should be updating according to terminology. Sometimes we see labeling that states in man this happened, and the drug is not approved for a male condition or a female condition. So for example, it's not approved in prostate cancer or erectile dysfunction, or it's not approved for a pregnancy-related indication or to prevent pregnancy. It's used for men and women. So you want to change that. It's 2019 in humans, or in men and humans. So change terminology that may have been placed there 50 years ago. Sometimes we see statements that are not related to the drug. So recently I was reviewing the labeling, and in the geriatric use subsection, it stated that geriatric patients, they're at higher risk for infections. That's true. However, that has nothing to do with the drug. The real question is, what effects do the drug have? Does the drug change the risk in geriatric patients of getting an infection compared to the use of the drug in younger adult patients? That's the real question. So we generally try to remove statements that have nothing to do with the drug. If we put these general statements in labeling, we would fill up all of our labeling with these general statements. And there are many other avenues to communicate these statements, white papers, journal articles, but not in prescription drug labeling. A very important principle that's in our regulations that one must not suggest or imply an unapproved use, indication, or dosage regimen. And there are many techniques, and we've talked about this several times at our other presentations in the past about what we can do to prevent an implication or suggestion of an unapproved use, indication, or dosage. Sometimes we see the investigational name of the product. As you know, drug nomenclature is somewhat complicated. Products that have a proprietary name, that they have one name, then they have the non-proprietary name. Now you're adding the investigational name of the drug. It may be very confusing to the healthcare provider to call something by 3 different names. Obviously, with a proprietary name and non-proprietary name, from a scientific standpoint, sometimes you have to use one versus the other. But investigational and drug names do not need to be included in labeling, and potentially they can be confusing. We found this is an example of basically looking at our labeling. So we found over 90 examples in prescription drug labeling that referred to products that were withdrawn from the market due to safety or efficacy reasons that are basically not available in the United States. So why should we be talking about drugs in prescription drug labeling that are not available with potentially safety problems or efficacy problems? If you can't use it, how relevant is that? So maybe 20 years ago, the drug was on the market, but why talk about a drug that's impossible to prescribe? It's not relevant, so you can consider removing that from prescription drug labeling. Sometimes standard of care changes. So for example, In the warnings and precautions section, one should generally include the risk mitigation strategy, how to prevent or manage or reduce the risk of a clinically significant adverse reaction or risk. If that's not known, one could be silent on that. But potentially, if there is a risk mitigation strategy, check to see that it's up to date. I put up an example here, periodic liver biopsies. That is typically not practice of medicine. Potentially measuring transaminases may be more appropriate, or other types of monitoring physical symptoms, signs that patients have. So look at that, particularly in the warnings and precautions section. Sometimes in prescription drug labeling, we see information directed to the patient. As stated previously, the prescribing information is for the learned healthcare practitioner. So one does not need to state pneumonia is diagnosed by cough, fever, fatigue, shortness of breath, chest pain. A healthcare provider who's prescribing that medication knows that. Now, that terminology may be very appropriate for patient labeling, but not the prescribing information. Sometimes there's unhelpful risk mitigation strategies. Recently, we've seen sometimes if there's potentially a drug interaction with warfarin, the recommendation, the proposed recommendation is to monitor your INR. Now, patients with warfarin, monitoring INR is part of the standard of care. The question is, what do you do differently, if anything? Do you monitor more frequently? Sometimes we'll see, a drug interaction associated with hypoglycemia. And the risk mitigation strategy is monitor glucose levels, in a diabetic. Well, diabetics that's part of the standard of care. You're not telling the healthcare provider anything different than what's normally done. So remove unhelpful information. We recommend avoiding non-specific terms and to include more quantitative items. And a lot of these examples are from the adverse reaction section of labeling guidance and the clinical studies section of labeling guidance. Some of these terms are ambiguous. They're subjective, but if you provide the actual numbers, it may be more meaningful to healthcare providers. So we talked about this earlier. So one of the principles is that when, let's say you're revising, you're submitting a PLR conversion, and you're looking at subsections 8.1 through 8.3. Potentially, there are other sections or subsections may be affected throughout the prescribing information. So, for example, if there's embryo-fetal toxicity, you want to check that warning and precaution to see if that's up to date. You want to check that contraindication to ensure that it doesn't have the old language from old format, that it's got language from the pregnancy and lactation labeling rule. So information and labeling may be located in many different sections or subsections of the prescribing information. If you're, for example, renal impairment may be, the information be in the pharmacokinetic subsection, in the clinical pharmacology section, it may be in the use in specific population section, it may be in the dosage administration section. It may be spread in many sections, it may be in the warnings and precautions section. So look throughout the labeling. In general, we recommend when developing labeling, we look at the data sections first. What do the data show? And then we go to other sections about making potentially recommendations. In addition, sometimes we see efficacy supplements submitted or labeling supplements submitted, and only a few sections are potentially updated, but we find that other sections may be outdated in a lot of the respects that we stated. So not only look at the content, what you're submitting, look throughout the entire prescribing information. One simple example is sometimes table titles. Before, now we're having a second indication, and titles of tables may need to be changed because you may want to identify what's in each of the patient population in the table, because now Previously, you only had one approved population, and maybe now you have 5. And healthcare providers may not be able to figure out what the table is showing, what data the table is showing, if you have many different populations. And the first table was named very generally. So 505(b)(2) labeling versus ANDA labeling. ANDA labeling for generic drug products. So first of all, the bedrock principle for ANDA labeling is ANDA labeling must be, quote unquote, the same as the reference listed drug or the NDA labeling. And same as, there may be some acceptable differences, permissible differences. For example, there's different maybe manufacturer information or distributor information may be supplied differently. There may be differences in the inactive ingredients. And there may be differences due to patent or exclusivity protection. So there could be differences between, those are some of the differences between the ANDA labeling and the RLD, the reference listed drug labeling. But in generally, it's the same as principle. With 505(b)(2) labeling, it's a totally different concept. 505(b)(2) labeling does not have the same as requirements. It does not have to be the same as the listed drug. For example, if the listed drug has labeling in old format, but a new 505(b)(2) NDA submitted, that labeling is subject to PLR and PLLR requirements. And that is a big change. So even though the listed drug may be approved 20 years ago, the B2 labeling must be up to date. It must meet all the statutory and regulatory requirements, and it must contain currently available information for healthcare providers to use drugs safely and effectively. So opportunities for application holders to submit prescribing information, to update, opportunities for application holders to update prescribing information. So when you're submitting, let's say it's a labeling supplement, whether it be a PLLR or a voluntary PLR conversion or an efficacy supplement, we recommend you review the entire labeling, not just the section and subsections that are affected, the entire labeling, and see if information is outdated, misleading, or clearly inapplicable. So now on to prescription drug labeling resources. We have made a lot of efforts of updating these existing resources and providing new resources for you. So we now have a one-stop shop for prescription drug labeling resources. This is called the Prescription Drug Labeling Resources webpage. And you can Google it, Bing, or use Bing, or any search engine for prescription drug labeling resources. This site was previously known as the PLR Requirements for Prescribing Information website. Now we changed the name because we changed the content. Previously it was focused on the prescribing information, particularly PLR format. We broadened it. So we recognize that a lot of labelers and companies don't just work on the prescribing information. They work on FDA-approved patient labeling. They work on card and container labeling. So this website provides a one-stop shop for all prescription drug labeling resources, prescribing information, FDA-approved patient labeling, as well as card and container labeling resources. We have over 100 labeling resources. And we continuously update this. If you have any recommendations, please contact us and we can upload additional labeling resources for you. So here are some examples of the labeling that we have, prescribing information, instructions for use, and here I'm showing the card and labeling. So on this website we have PLR, Physician Labeling Rule requirements, and also the rule. We have our guidances. So almost all guidances, all labeling guidance that we're going to discuss during this time are on this website. So it's one-stop shopping. We have our presentations. So 2015, as Brenda mentioned, 2017 we talked. If you weren't able to attend, it's on the website. And it's ordered according to section or subsection, how it appears in the prescribing information, if it's specifically about sections or subsections, or it's ordered according to broad labeling content. So the slides here that we're presenting today and tomorrow, most of them will go on the website in the next several weeks. So we'll have that for you also in that setting. As discussed before, it's important to have good organization, good format for PLR. So we've provided some format tools for you. We have the selected requirements for prescribing information tool, which is a useful tool that contain format items from regulations and a few guidances. We have a sample PLR template that one could use. We have instructional videos. We have established pharmacological classes. Resources, as you know, established pharmacological class is required in the indications and usage heading in the highlights of prescribing information if there is an EPC. And we have a listing of active moieties and established pharmacological classes. And we update that every several months. We have additional labeling resources for ANDAs, specifically about 4 or 5 labeling guidances for ANDAs. And we recently added a biological product specific labeling area. Given the importance of biological products, we're going to have a talk tomorrow morning about transition products as well as biosimilar products. And our guidances and other resources like the Purple Book are on this site. We added a lot of additional product quality related resources and carton container labeling resources. As I stated, the second half of tomorrow's presentation will have a lot intense presentations about carton container labeling and product quality labeling resources. We have patient labeling specific resources. We're having a talk also on instructions for use tomorrow. So again, one-stop shop. We have a searching for medication guides, the instructions for use guidance, and then we have our labeling databases. So this is drugs at FDA. How many people have used drugs at FDA before? Wow, everyone. So the title of the slide states that drugs at FDA will be updated soon. So the updates happened yesterday. So I'm glad to tell you that yesterday we updated drugs at FDA. Updates include new information for the user in terms of what's in drugs at FDA and what's not in drugs at FDA. So as you know, drugs at FDA contain CDER regulated approved products. It does not contain information about vaccines, cellular or gene therapy, allergenics, plasma expanders. It doesn't contain information about devices or animal drugs. It doesn't contain information about OTC monograph products. So it contains information about approved products in CDER. So we have disclaimers about that. It also has very helpful hints. If you're unsuccessful in your searching, it gives you some reminders about different search techniques you could use to improve your search ability. We also are, I don't know if you have seen this, we are also we publicly announced this, we're changing how we do our reviews. We have something known as the integrated review template. So this is multidisciplinary review that goes essentially in one review. This is to remove redundancy, to improve our communication of what we think about the claims of the drug, what we think about the provability of the drug, and why it contains the risk-benefit analysis. And this information is available on Drugs at FDA, the reviews. We have a new searching tool. This is FDA Label that have come online maybe in the last year or two. This tool is very similar, to Daily Med NIH's Daily Med in the sense that it's got the same content. However, it's got different searching capabilities. As a reminder, this contains about 110,000 structured product labeling files submitted by firms. And it's a diverse amount of products, so it includes prescription drugs, labeling for prescription drugs, over-the-counter products, whether approved under NDAs or they're marketed under the OTC monograph. It includes dietary supplements, as well as devices, cosmetics, medical foods. You can search by application type. You can also search by labeling section or subsection. And these are files, again, submitted by application holders. So, challenge question for everybody. So, 505(b)(2) labeling must be the same as the listed drugs labeling, except for which of the following items? A, inactive ingredients. B, dosage forms. C, recommended dosage. D, warnings. For example, a warning in the warnings and precautions section. E, A and B. Or F, none of the above. And I'll give you several seconds to think about this question. Okay, great. So the answer is F, none of the above. As stated previously, 505(b)(2) labeling is a standalone labeling. I should say standalone labeling. It may be different from the listed drug labeling. ANDA labeling has the same as requirements. But 505(b)(2) labeling, as stated previously, may be required to be in PLR format. However, the listed drug may be in old format. So summary, we certainly encourage voluntary PLR conversion. Before submitting a labeling supplement or an efficacy supplement under an NDA or a BLA to the FDA, review the entire prescribing information. Not only all the sections and subsections that the content affects, but the entire prescribing information. And as discussed, we have multiple labeling resources for prescription drugs. If you have any recommendations for the site, please let us know. And I'll show you our updated guidances. These are future labeling guidances that are expected to be published. This is on our guidance agenda that was submitted, that is publicly available. This is last updated in March. So here are future labeling guidances. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Eric. This is the first opportunity we have for Q&A. Please bear with me while I do a little Q&A housekeeping, since this is our first go-around. Those of you online, hopefully you remember to be putting the questions into the Q&A pod, which are right down below us at the very bottom. We've been gathering those up as we go along. You can continue to put questions in there. Please take the time to type carefully. Makes it easier for us to understand the questions. For those of you here in the room, the way this works is there are 2 microphones in the room. If you have a question for Eric, come on down and form a line at whichever one of the mics is closest to you. When you come up, you get 1 question per turn, because there are other people online, other people in the room who want to ask questions too. If you try to sneak in a second question in 1 turn, you have to buy lunch for everyone sitting in the row that you're at. So keep an eye on your neighbor, everybody. Also, if you have questions about an application that is currently being reviewed by the agency, this is not the forum to ask questions about that application. If you have questions about future policy or prognostication, or where the agency may be thinking on things outside what Eric presented on, This is not the venue for those types of questions. Again, we want to keep general questions that will be useful to everybody on the topic that Eric covered. With that, if you have questions in the room, come on down and we'll basically move from one mic to the next and then to online. So right here at microphone number 2, nice and close for me, please.
Okay, hi, Cheryl Madsen from Calathera Biosciences. I had a question. You mentioned that the FDA, drugs at FDA is being updated. Is there any move afoot to update that with supplemental approval documents? So, for example, a drug like Keytruda, where it has the original approval in melanoma, then subsequent approvals are posted, but only say the letter and the label are posted and not those summary review documents for additional indications. And that would be very valuable to industry. Is there any initiative at FDA to do that?
Great question, and so we've received this question. As you stated, that reviews, meeting minutes are posted on drugs at FDA for NMEs, new biological products, other original NDAs. But for efficacy supplements and labeling supplements, sometimes they are posted on drugs at FDA, sometimes they are not. We certainly want to publish and post as many reviews as possible because we want to provide that to you in terms of the rationale for our decisions. Essentially, it has to do with resources. We'll take that back, you know what I mean? But we recognize the value of that for you. We have a movement to post as much as we can, and we'll be certainly talking to drugs FDA about that.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you, Eric. I was just wondering if you could expand on the process of, excuse me, how the labeling policy team reviews USPIs versus the reviewers, the clinical reviewers. How does the interaction work? When does your team review versus the reviewers? Do they review first? If you could just tell us a little bit about that.
Well, great question. So the question is about the role and responsibilities of our team, labeling development team, labeling policy team. We changed our name. And multidisciplinary reviewers. So typically, our team reviews a relatively small percentage of labeling. We're involved when we're asked to get involved from typically the associate director for labeling in the division, particularly if there's a complex labeling issue that the division maybe hasn't seen, or something that's precedent setting, or something that's policy setting. Our team are involved in developing guidances, are working with other groups in developing labeling policy. We try to bring that to other groups. We all work with every single prescription drug review division. So if one division has not seen something before, we'll try to share those experiences that we've learned from other divisions. The main people who develop labeling, it's a multidisciplinary approach. Clinical, pharm tox, biostats, clinical pharmacology, the associate director for labeling, the signatory, medication errors, risk management. We have some regulatory staff, sometimes it's CDER. It depends upon the application, but we're called in for complex labeling or labeling that have policy implications. Additionally, sometimes divisions can be overloaded. Maybe we've had some divisions that have they're reviewing multiple NMEs and new biological products, so that they have a ton of efficacy supplements. We'll help them because sometimes you don't know what's coming in the door, and so we're here to help.
All right, and again, if there's any questions in the room, come on up to the microphone, but let's go ahead and take our first online question, please.
Should the highlights and content sections be hyperlinked?
Good question. So the question is about highlights and contents about linking. So in structured product labeling files, the cross-references in the full prescribing information are hyperlinked. In the table of contents, there's hyperlinking. And in the highlights, the references are hyperlinked. If you're talking about a PDF file, you have an option of using hyperlinks in the highlights, contents, and full prescribing information. One of the things we have seen, so it's acceptable to do that. Sometimes we have seen labeling where it looks blue, like it looks like it's hyperlinked, and it doesn't work. So we recommend, if you actually want a hyperlink in the PDF file, make sure it works.
Okay, I think we had a person coming back up to the mic. Please help yourself.
Hi, I'm Lisa McNair. I'm from BioMarin. On slide 28, I think you mentioned the concept of being silent. I think you spoke to it more. And it's something that I've seen teams struggle with because it's a complicated issue and it usually requires some deep understanding of what it is that you're trying to address. It's not an easy surface type issue. Can you give some examples of when it's appropriate to be silent and when it would be absolutely inappropriate, or advise of how it's addressed during reviews on an ongoing basis? So for initial reviews and applications, there's an interdisciplinary team, but for ongoing reviews is the same level of, I guess, rigorous assessment completed to make sure that it's appropriate.
That's a fantastic question with respect to when is it appropriate not to include a risk mitigation strategy, for example, for clinically significant adverse reaction or risk in the warnings and precautions section. I think that obviously it's some of this is application specific. Sometimes programs basically have stopping criteria built into the study design about when, how things were stopped, or programs have concomitant medication to address adverse reactions, and sometimes we use that we have data actually. We can look at the percentage of patients who received concomitant medication to address a specific adverse reaction that what was thought of before, and we can see how successful that was. So that's extremely helpful. Some of it has to do with clinical practice. Can be a very challenging area if there's a situation where you don't absolutely have the data for that situation. But we really try to rely on as much information from that NDA or BLA of how that program was designed. What are the consequences of the clinically significant adverse reactions? In terms of, you also have to think about the disease, the population. Is this a benign disease, a relatively benign disease, where you may have a lower threshold to stop the drug versus malignancy, where you likely won't want to stop the drug, or another life-threatening disorder? That's also part of the calculus. It's a good question. It's a question that's challenging for us, but those are some of the factors we use.
Okay, and that's all the time we have right now for Eric, so please help me thank Eric for his